Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. You all hear me? Wonderful. Thank you for being here, especially on such a sunny day. And we're really, really delighted to have what is really a timely conversation. And we're also particularly delighted to have this conversation today with an alum. I will not spend too long presenting our guest, but Ambassador Julianne Smith is an SIS alum. She's had a distinguished career in national security, a distinguished career by way of think tanks, by way sometimes of a twist in the road, as I found out today, that ended up in the Pentagon, even though that wasn't the plan. Also, obviously, working in the White House and working most recently as the U.S. permanent representative to NATO. So plenty to talk about. And I'm also delighted to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Jim Goldgeier. And so we'll start with some questions, but rest assured that we will all be called upon and expected to participate. So with that, let me hand it over to Jim for the first question.
Great. Thanks so much. And Julie, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I did say to our esteemed guest on the way in, this really is the nerdiest school around. It is gorgeous outside. You're amazing. And so we want to make this a very worthwhile hour for you. And we wanted to start just by asking Ambassador Smith about, like, if she were back in your shoes, back in the day when she was at AU and she was thinking about it, like, what would she advise you as you think about where you're going to go when you leave this esteemed and nerdy institution for whatever you're going to do next, and just how to think about the opportunities that might present themselves, or even, you know, they're still here. So things they might want to make sure they do while they're still in school here, but just how to think about it. And I'd just be curious how many of you came to SIS thinking that you might be interested in a career in the federal government. You can raise it high. It's okay. Yeah. So yeah, with pride. Okay. So that's important also, just to be thinking about that as well.
Is this working? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the invitation, Garrett and Jim. Great to be here. So we'll try to liven it up and make it interesting because you could be out in the sunshine. So yes, as Jim noted, and I'm eager to hear your questions. So a couple of things, two main messages for people that are jumping out into the workforce soon. Number one is you might be looking at the U.S. government, those of you interested in public service, and be thinking to yourself, this might not be the best year to try and get a job in government because it seems like some federal agencies are disappearing and others are shrinking. And so I just wanted to relay a story. I graduated, just to date myself, I hate to even say it, but I graduated with my graduate degree from SIS in 1995. And when I came out, for one reason or another, there was a hiring freeze across the U.S. government. And I was devastated because I thought, now that I have this graduate degree, I had some work experience between my BA and my MA, I really wanted to serve in government. And I knocked on every door possible, and it just felt insurmountable. And then I went to all the think tanks in town, and that felt insurmountable because, of course, there were hundreds of us applying for every single position. And so I ended up working in management consulting, and that didn't seem to fit my dream of working in national security and foreign policy, but I did it for a year or two. I learned how to read an annual report. I learned a lot about the private sector. I acquired some interesting skill sets, how to put together a decent presentation, and it all worked out fine. Eventually, I made my way back to national security and foreign policy, and that's my second message, which some of you heard me say an hour ago in another session. And that is that there is no set path to working in foreign policy and national security. You can come into it later in life. You can start when you're in your low 20s. You can come from Wall Street, from academia. You can come from the private sector, from management consulting. You can come from a whole variety of paths, and just don't fret that you're not ticking boxes off a list. We are not training to be engineers or doctors or dentists. There's not like a set path to make your way. Foreign policy and national security has an enormous amount of flexibility, and it allows you to enter the field of national security as you define it. And maybe you start in the nonprofit sector and end up in federal government. Maybe you start as a foreign service officer and you end up in the private sector or working in Congress later. So for those of you that are about to take the leap, don't sweat it. It is going to work out. Maybe for the next couple of years, it's going to be hard to find your way into the federal government. Maybe not. We can't predict with any certainty, but just have an open mind and know that kind of all roads lead to Rome and that you'll eventually get there. And my last message is what I loved about being at SIS is I just did so many internships. I did summer internships. I did internships during the school year. For those of you just starting out, don't miss the chance to work in Washington, get your feet wet, have internships. Some of you have worked already before coming to SIS, but take a chance on this is your time to try on different hats, and you have lots of opportunities to try hats, see what fits, what doesn't feel right, and then jump into the job market. So my 2 cents. Yeah.
Great. So obviously your last stint was as permanent representative at NATO for the United States. And so obviously a lot happened in those 3 years. So I think the question is essentially, of those 3 years, what was maybe your proudest moment, maybe the most challenging? And if time permits, is there a quirky, anecdote of being ambassador? I'm going to use the example of the chair of our department was an ambassador the United States to Mongolia, and amongst her strange activities was preparing pies on Mongolian television as part of her experience. So if you have a quirky anecdote of the life of an ambassador, that's always welcome.
Okay. So I mean, it was an incredibly rewarding experience to serve as the U.S. Perm Rep at NATO, particularly in light of the fact I didn't know this was coming when I agreed to serve, but once the war in Ukraine started, it obviously gave the role a completely different feel, and we had a completely different agenda. So I was confirmed in November of 2021. So I fly to Brussels late that month, and I'm handed loads of intelligence that indicates that we know with certainty that Russia's going to start this war early sometime in 2023. And my job is to convince the allies that this is really happening, because we had been sharing intelligence and the allies, for the most part, didn't believe us, nor did the Ukrainians. And then to begin the work at NATO on contingency planning to prepare for the day when the war would start. And so it was an enormously complicated job, in part because we had, again, allies that didn't believe the intelligence. They thought this was simply posturing, that the Russians would never cross into Ukrainian territory, and therefore we didn't need to do the contingency planning. We had some allies that thought that Russia might do this, but they weren't prepared to kind of pull all the levers at NATO and do the necessary heavy lifting to prepare. And so I felt like I was just working each and every day with a couple of other colleagues across the alliance to make the case that war was likely coming. And even if there was a 70% or 50% chance, we had to do the necessary work to get ready for it. It went well in the end. December and January were tough. Early February got better when we had more and more certainty. We even got down to the day the war would start. So that when I really was radiating pride was when my phone rang at 3 a.m. on the morning of February 24th and the war had started. We were told to come in for an 8 a.m. emergency North Atlantic Council meeting. And when we got into the room, First of all, one of the ambassadors from Eastern Europe raised his hand and said, I just want to say at the top something to the US ambassador. I didn't believe you, and I need to just let that out and say it, which I felt was very brave in that moment. And then the meeting started, and it was like a ballet. Like, we had done so much planning. We knew exactly what we were doing. In a matter of minutes, we had activated NATO's graduated response plans, which kind of ups the escalation ladder of NATO preparedness. And then we had activated NATO's rapid response force. Everything started moving, and it felt good that there was a group of us working with the Secretary General to prepare for that moment, and we were at the ready. So really one of the most amazing moments of my career to witness that and witness the allies coming together. Quirky moment, and there were so many quirky moments. I don't, I don't know where to, maybe we'll come back to that. I have a couple of funny stories. Maybe I'll save those for the end. Yeah.
So I'm going to just follow up on your previous answer because, as we know, there are certain things that Donald Trump believes very strongly, and one of them is that allies don't add value to American national security, that they have played Uncle Sam for suckers, that we've provided their defense, that they've gotten rich while we paid for their defense, and that they don't, that there's not an added benefit. So I just thought it might be helpful for people just to hear from somebody who's worked closely with our allies. If you could just say a few words about what our allies do that in fact enhances American national security.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you for asking. As ambassador, actually, I traveled a little bit in the United States. I did kind of a road tour through Ohio, and I did some tours through my home state of Michigan just to listen to Americans talk about NATO and Ukraine. And it is funny how increasingly you get this question, like, why do we have this alliance? Like, I understand why we created it at the time in the wake of World War II and what its purpose was during the Cold War, but it seems like it's kind of creaky and rusty and outdated, and we don't really need this alliance anymore. And it's a challenge to talk about how NATO is relevant today. Obviously, in the framing of the Ukraine war, we were talking a lot about NATO returning to its core mission. I mean, there was a time when NATO had a 20-year mission in Afghanistan. It was operating a counter-piracy mission off the coast of Somalia, forces in the Western Balkans. But with Ukraine, it was returning to collective defense. And so what happened when Russia went into Ukraine was not only individual allies across the alliance providing critical economic and military assistance to Ukraine so that the US wasn't the only ally providing assistance, which is sometimes the perception. But the US did put 20,000 additional troops in Eastern Europe, but Western European allies moved far more troops into Eastern Europe to fortify the eastern flank just in case Putin got any ideas about attacking NATO territory. So first and foremost, I would say at the top, these are our most capable allies. Yes, they have underspent on defense for 30 plus years, but they still, you're not going to find more capable allies anywhere else in the world. These are allies that we exercise and train with. We share a command and control system with so that when we do have to deploy, we can deploy together under one command and operate seamlessly together. But also it's above and beyond the military piece of it. There's the political piece of it. We stand for our values. We stand for our shared interests. We protect those values, and our unity is one of the greatest cards that we have to play. I mean, why is Putin working so hard? Why, for many years, has he tried to separate Europe or divide Europe from within or divide Europe from the United States? Because Putin, and President Xi does too, understands that strength comes from unity, that when you collectively take action, it's much better and stronger than having one nation say we won't stand for it. So our goal for the last 3 years at NATO was to maintain unity and make sure that the allies weren't allowing the Russians to drive a wedge between any of our positions. The danger now is that with the current US administration, they've raised questions about the utility of unity, and we're starting to see cracks in it that, of course, are a delight to both President Putin and President Xi. But yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I'll take a break.
And do you think, I mean, what can if the United States really is in the process of pulling back from Europe and even pulling back from support for Ukraine? I mean, Presidents Trump and Putin had their phone call today. I mean, we don't really know how this is going to manifest itself. We don't know what the United States would be willing to provide Ukraine for its defense of what remains as a sovereign Ukraine. It's very clear Putin doesn't want a sovereign Ukraine at all. How much can Europe do in order to help protect, preserve, defend, support a sovereign Ukraine?
Well, it will be really hard for Europe to take a course that is separate from that of the United States. And I think what Europe has been trying to do in recent weeks is to showcase to the current US administration that they are prepared to put troops in Europe, that they could generate 30,000 troops to be some sort of over-the-horizon force that maybe stands behind the Ukrainian forces or works with them or is on call. But of course, in order for that to happen, because many European countries still lack the enablers that they need the United States somewhere in Eastern Europe also on call. They may need help with lift, actually getting their troops to Ukraine. They may need help with intelligence. Certainly, to the extent that there's any heavy equipment that is required, oftentimes that burden is placed on the United States. The Europeans can do a lot. They're investing more in their defense than ever before. Real resources are on the table, but at the end of the day, they still lack some critical, heavy legacy systems or bright, shiny new systems that would enable them to not only deploy 30,000 troops, but sustaining that. On the political front, they still can play an active role. They are trying, all of them, very hard to ensure that Ukraine has a seat at the table and that this isn't simply a deal that's cut between the United States and Russia without any input from Ukraine. And of course, on the reconstruction side, when that day comes, Europe will be absolutely indispensable and no doubt will play the leading role. So Europe should, in my view, always have a voice and a vote on what's transpiring vis-a-vis Ukraine. Unfortunately, I get the feeling right now that President Trump looks at this largely through the Washington-Moscow lens and is leaving out both our friends in Ukraine and our friends in Europe.
So I'm sure we will talk more about today's phone call, but there was also, and I know that you have a connection to Germany and you spent time there was a pretty consequential vote today in the Bundestag to unlock resources, to go beyond the debt brake, which had really limited what Germany could do. And certainly for those of us who have worked on European security, there's a risk of this time it's really different. But do you feel that actually this time there's a chance that this might be a really consequential moment, that what happened today, that vote will really be a big shift for Europe, regardless of how relations with the United States continue, that this is a real seminal moment with now Germany, of all countries, also playing a significant role in defense?
Yeah, this time it's different. I mean, I've been looking at NATO allies' defense spending for the better part of 20 or 30 years now, and there have been over the years many pledges to do more, different constructs of how they'll do that in the European Union, at NATO. individual nations pledging things. I will say, once the war started, we saw major changes in Europe. I mean, to give Germany credit where credit is due, they did put 100 billion euros on the table 3 days after the war started. They have made significant investments already. It was a little slow out of the gates. They had trouble allocating the resources. It was a little sloppily done in my view, but in large part, I think they are owed some kudos and some applause around their decision to put real resources forward to get to 2%. 2% isn't going to be enough. We're going to have to go beyond 2%. And I predict that at the summit this summer, NATO allies are going to go to 3 or 3.5%. I think that's quite obvious. But in the meantime, we're seeing other very dynamic, innovative solutions, including talk in the European Union of changing the way they look at debt, because some countries do complain that it's the EU, Italy says this all the time, the EU holding them back from spending more on defense. And so von der Leyen at the Munich Security Conference this year really said, we've got to open up this whole debate. And they're putting, also, they hope to unlock upwards of 800 billion euros. That's real money, and making new loans available. And then when you pair it with the decision out of Berlin today, I mean, this is unbelievable. We will look back on this moment in history as the turning point when Europe finally ended years and decades of underinvestment and really started investing real resources in their defense. And the trick now is to ensure that they're spending it wisely, that they don't get too caught up in only spending it in Europe, because European defense industry is incapable of really absorbing those kinds of numbers and delivering. I mean, they're going to have to be a little open-minded, at least in the short term, about non-EU countries providing some of that kit, whether it's South Korea or the United Kingdom or our own country. But right now, they obviously have visions of building out their own defense industrial base, and I salute that, but it'll take time. So these decisions are critical, I mean, profound, and will go down in the history books as a turning point, but we will not feel the impact of these decisions for another decade. I think it will take a significant amount of time for Europeans to really build up the capabilities they need to be more on par with the United States.
And we're going to turn momentarily to you all. So if you have a question, come line up behind the mic, and we'll get to you as soon as we do. One more here, which is about China. And I mean, one of the things, during the first Trump administration, NATO for the first time mentioned China as a threat. And, there was a lot of speculation that that was partly because the Europeans were trying to show Trump that they did have value added and that they could support, a U.S. policy that viewed China as a major threat. And we've seen then in the succeeding years, we've seen NATO more and more delineate what the threat from China is to the Euro-Atlantic community. And we've seen at the last 3 NATO summits the appearance of the heads of state from the so-called Indo-Pacific for New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And just curious, your thought, I mean, this is something that has been a concerted effort to get the Europeans to get in a mindset of China really is a threat and we've got to work together to deal with that threat from China. How concerned should we be about China being able to take advantage of rifts between Europe and the United States to actually seek opportunities with Europe in which they no longer take that approach?
Yeah, so the China piece is actually the untold story of some remarkable changes in the NATO alliance over the last 4 years. We were very focused on Ukraine, and we were very focused on flashpoints in the Western Balkans for all the obvious reasons. But what happened in NATO over these last 4 years, first of all, to go back in time even further. So in the first Trump administration, we had NATO conduct its first China review. That's important because the alliance was able to kind of agree that it would look at China as a challenge in the Euro-Atlantic area. So that was step number one and an important one. And then we kind of came in the Biden administration, took the baton and started running with it to essentially ensure that China could be mentioned in the strategic concept. So you know, Jim, full well that the alliance rewrites the strategic concept once every 10 years. 2022 was the year when we were going to revisit NATO's strategic concept, its kind of mission statement. And we were able to get all 30 allies at the time, we didn't have Sweden and Finland at the table yet, to put China into the strategic concept. And once something goes into the strategic concept, as you well know, it becomes the driver of policies and actions across the alliance. So we did a lot on China. We had several intelligence briefings. We talked a lot about China's provision of dual-use components to the Russians that were used in the war in Ukraine and continue to be used in the war in Ukraine. We deepened our relationship with those 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific. I took my first trip, the first trip ever of NATO ambassadors to the Indo-Pacific. I took 8 ambassadors to Tokyo and Seoul to talk about cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure, disinformation campaigns stemming from both China and Russia. So it felt like this whole new dawn inside the alliance. There was some resistance. Some allies were not totally sold on this new area of work and were worried that the alliance was going to go global and suddenly have new members in the Indo-Pacific, but that's not what the point was. The point was for us to work together on Ukraine, work together on things like cybersecurity, share best practices and insights. And oh, by the way, when North Korea sent the 11,000 troops to Russia to fight in Kursk, the South Koreans came into the alliance and briefed the intelligence. And if that's not a sign of things that have changed inside the alliance, I don't know what else is. My concern now, when you come in government, you're always trying to catch up and understand what happened while you were out of government. So I hope everybody that's settling into their seats right now will eventually have some appreciation of all that good work we did on China. I think Democrats and Republicans, that's one area where we agree. And I would hope that my successor and his colleagues will take the baton again and ensure that Europe's doing good work with the United States on China, because if we don't do that, the Chinese will be all too excited to kind of come in and take advantage of that gap and say to the Europeans, you know what, those guys, the Americans, are pretty unreliable, a little unstable at the moment. Why don't you hang with us? And then the whole project falters because you don't have that unity of purpose between Europe and the United States on the China challenge.
Who would
Please,
like, yes.
Yeah, please line up
And we introduce yourself?
and be concise. Make sure it ends with a question mark.
Thank you so much. My name is Ito. I'm a graduate student here, and my question relates to the recent statement that Donald Tusk, not Trump, made recently, mainly raising eyebrows about nuclear weapons that Poland might pursue. Now, I'm more interested because NATO has a lot of members, and as somebody who has interacted with policies that are changing in times of war, who do you see as, obviously Poland and Germany, but other than that, who do you see from the meeting room perspective as countries who are likely to step up to the plate and try to take more of the leadership and more of the reins, and we should kind of look out for and see how they're doing? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So there are a number of countries that are eager to step up and play more of a leadership role. I think Germany, once it gets through this election cycle and everybody gets to work as part of the new coalition that's coming into government in Berlin, you will see, I think, a Chancellor Merz asserting himself and trying to lead Europe. I do, however, also believe that President Macron Macron believes that he's in a position to lead Europe as well. And they agree on a lot, but I could see some friction between those two capitals on how best to lead in this moment. Poland, no doubt, it continues to showcase its investment in defense. It's inching towards 5% of GDP, more than the United States as a percentage of GDP, and wants to have that close relationship with Washington and play a leadership role there. But I would also note we have two members, new members of the alliance, Sweden and Finland, very dynamic, very innovative, full of fresh thinking, fresh ideas. They want to kind of bring a Nordic perspective into the alliance, into the transatlantic relationship. They want to lead. So I think you can watch those corners. There's always the big three. So it's not just Paris and Berlin, but London as well. And then lastly, I would watch institutions. So I think Kaja Kallas has come in as the former Estonian prime minister. She's got lots of big ideas on what she wants to do on the foreign policy and defense agenda. They have a new commissioner for defense from Lithuania, if I'm not mistaken, who has big visions as well. And then Mark Rutte only arrived at the alliance in last October as the new SecGen, and he's widely liked across the alliance, has a lot of credibility as also a former prime minister. And so I would watch both NATO and the EU and then a couple of capitals around Europe. I think you're going to see a lot of fresh thinking, new ideas. Some ideas will, may miss the mark, but there could be some really interesting developments in the weeks ahead.
Ruta's photo should be either on that wall or the wall out there from when he visited SIS when he was prime minister. Yeah.
Hello, my name is John Saunders. I am a retired DoD employee. I was at NDU for 30 years. My question is about the current future ambassador, Matthew Woodacre, and your opinion on his qualifications and how you think he will react and act to his boss.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all of your time serving with DoD and at NDU. So Matt Whitaker, he's not a traditional national security foreign policy pick by any means. But I think if you look at his Senate confirmation hearing, I mean, I thought he came in very well prepared. I thought his statements on NATO were fairly mainstream and aligned with most Republican and Democratic views on the alliance. He didn't say anything that was especially jarring to me. I didn't hear anything about getting rid of the alliance or not participating in the alliance or not coming to a summit. I thought we heard a lot of the themes we've heard from not just Republican administrations, but Democratic administrations about the need to invest more in defense spending. So I watched it out of interest. I've had some engagement with him as he's been preparing for his confirmation hearing. And I think he will be effective because what you always want in any ambassadorial role is someone who has connective tissue back home. And he is someone who knows Donald Trump well, having been handpicked to serve at DOJ in the first Trump administration. So I can't really pass judgment. It's hard for me to say, but I will say watching his confirmation hearing, I felt relatively reassured.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity, and thank you for your service, dear Ambassador. My name is Rahim Rashidi, or Mr. Kurd. President Trump called me Mr. Kurd. I'm a Kurdish journalist. And what will be the NATO future? And second question should be, how would you describe the Peshmerga role in fight against terrorism and especially ISIS? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm
today.
representative of the Kurdistani Diaspora Confederation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to probably stick more with your first question because it's what I know best. So in terms of the future of the NATO alliance, I mean, unfortunately right now, there are a lot of open-ended questions about what the alliance will look like in the coming years, because we do have a U.S. administration that is expressing skepticism, as Jim noted, about the utility of the NATO alliance, whether or not the U.S. is getting what it gives out of the alliance alliance. I do think, however, that once we get through this summit this June in The Hague, we might be in a better position. President Trump plans to come to the summit. It's going to be a summit where the allies, again, I predict will make a major announcement on defense spending, which is something he cares deeply about. And I think he will find that he is welcomed at the table. Mark Rutte is somebody that he knows. And I'm hoping that perhaps once we get through that summit, there'll be some better kind of signaling towards the alliance post-summit. I can't predict whether or not that's going to be the case. I can sketch for you some darker scenarios. I could sketch out for you a scenario in which the trust that has served as the foundation of the transatlantic relationship and NATO erodes to the degree that Europeans just no longer believe that the United States will be there for them in a pinch. If anything goes off the rails, if they have a security requirement of any kind, and we could see Europe moving again away from the United States, away from NATO, developing more capacity in the European Union, in their own national capacities, and investing less politically in the alliance. So we just don't know which way this is headed. Some mornings I wake up and I think, maybe we're really turning the page on 80 years of transatlantic relations. And I question what's going to follow and whether or not that serves both the interests of the United States and Europe. But I have other days where I think, look, there were many moments throughout the last 80 years where many of us were prepared to issue last rites on the transatlantic relationship, and we weathered the storm. So I'm hoping, and I really, on my more positive days, I hope we land on that side of the ledger. But in all honesty, I mean, this is a very difficult time for the relationship, and I don't want to belittle that. I think I'm going to leave that for another day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to mention as well, the event is recorded for archival purposes, so there's no need to record any of the answers, just to be clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Hao. I'm a 2025 Fulbright in the AU Law School from China. I have a question, a very simple question about China, that in the acceleration of the Taiwan Strait atmosphere and in the China propaganda narratives, the Quad usually described as Asian NATOs. How do you think will the Quad function as the same as NATO? This is the first question. The second is with the threat of the Russians, maybe more and more the Central Asian countries will apply to join the NATO in the future. Maybe the Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan will do the same things in the in the future. So will NATO consider this new applications in the Asian countries? And if it does, do you think it will bring more concern of the coalition of China and the Russian? Thank you.
Sure, I got all of the second question.
What if the Central Asian countries seek to join NATO?
Okay, right. Okay, so first the Quad, not the Quad that we sometimes reference in Europe with the United States. So we're not talking about Paris, Berlin, London, and Washington. You have a question about the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, and whether or not that could emerge to be some sort of Asian NATO. I don't see any evidence of that. This is a different type of relationship. The Biden administration invested a lot in both Quads, but in the Asian Quad throughout President Biden's tenure. They saw great value in convening at the highest levels, including the leaders level, and they wanted to invest more in the relationships that existed across that Quad. But we never got to the point where there was any conversation or talk about a military alliance, and we don't even frame the Quad as an alliance per se. It is more a group of countries that find great utility in strengthening their cooperation. And So I don't know where the Trump administration is going to go with that quad. We'll have to see. But under any future administration, I would be shocked if we found it evolving towards some sort of NATO framework, because it's a completely different beast. On the countries of Central Asia, I mean, we have not seen, so NATO, first of all, to step back, NATO has 32 members, but over 35 partners around the world. And they're in all corners. NATO has partners in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East and beyond, and the Indo-Pacific, of course, as we talked about. But I have not heard many countries in Central Asia actually expressing an interest in deepening or even launching some sort of partnership with NATO proper. NATO's door to partnerships remains open. And should a country be interested in exploring something like that, Argentina came through the door in my last few weeks in Brussels, expressing an interest in a potential NATO partnership. NATO's always ready to sit down at the table and say, what interests you? Why are you interested in partnering with this alliance? What are you looking for? But again, we heard very few countries in Central Asia express an interest in terms of the stands. And it just wasn't something that came up in our day-to-day work. But again, should any of those countries reach a point where they wanted to explore it, they should know that NATO's door is open.
Hello, Ambassador. My name is Jonah. I'm a high schooler here at DC, and I have a question regarding something Washington Latin Public Charter School. So this is a question relating back to what you said earlier, right? So obviously there was a lot of skepticism regarding possible posturing when it came from Russia's invasion. Recently, the October 7th report dropped from the Middle East, which showed that there was clear-cut rhetorical and strategic evidence that an attack might happen, and it was ignored. Even when it comes to domestic issues, I'm sorry. I tend to speak fast, but even when it comes to domestic issues with rhetoric Donald Trump has said and people not believing it, even though he's explicitly said it. I was curious, how do you work to convince people in these high stress situations where there's clear cut intelligence, like people are saying exactly what they mean, and yet people still don't believe it? And I was curious, like what kind of skills you use as an ambassador to work through these challenging situations.
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. So it's not easy to come in and try and change the views of your colleagues around the North Atlantic table, Council table, the NAC table. We sit in a big circle in alphabetical order, and you can have meetings off to the side too, and that's often more effective than trying to persuade someone in the North Atlantic Council. But in the case of Ukraine, what our approach was, we started with the idea that we needed to flood, absolutely, like give the Europeans everything we could get our hands on. And there, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, was absolutely indispensable. She took the decision with the White House, with the president, to share an unprecedented amount of intelligence with our allies. So it wasn't just us walking in and saying, hey, we think Russia's going to go to war in Ukraine, trust us. Or we're going to give you this little piece of intelligence, it's satellite imagery of that, which they're like, we have that, and so we had to think outside the box. What is it that we have in hand that they most likely lack, whether it's signals intelligence, satellite imagery, or something else, that we feel would give them certainty that we mean business when we say this is going to happen. And we have to, first and foremost, you have to understand the other person's argument. So in many cases, countries were saying, we see, Julie, it's not that we don't see the tanks move. We can see the tanks moving, but they do this all the time. They get ready for an exercise, they pull right up, and then they go right back. This is a classic playbook. Why are you so concerned this time? It was when we brought the intelligence in and said the blood banks have arrived on the scene. And when they move the blood banks, they are there for a reason, because they believe soldiers will be injured. And so therefore, we are certain that based on what they are moving above and beyond troops and tanks, that we know they mean business. And then, of course, we had other pieces of intelligence that we could share that would preview things that would make it clear. So number one is is understand where the other person's coming from. Number two is you've got to go above and beyond maybe your usual intelligence sharing. And number three, you just have to keep at it every single day. And so on a Wednesday, you have the conversation and they're like, we don't believe you. You go back Thursday, you try it again. Friday, then you bring in a higher level briefer. Then you call the White House and you're like, you've got to call Paris, get the president on the line with Macron. So a lot of your work in government is what can I do at my level and how can I help the president? And then what do I have to move up the chain to the National Security Advisor, to the Secretary of State, or to the president? You got to be really careful with those calls because you can't say every week you need an assist. But in this case, we knew there were select countries that needed a touch with the president to make the case on a secure call. And then we sent high level, I mean, Avril Haines was flying over to Brussels, felt like every other week, to try and make the case along with Tony Blinken and others. So it was a concerted team effort. We were doing it here in Washington with their embassies, and we were working our teams in country as well. But a lot of that heavy lifting happened inside the alliance. It's a whole team effort. It has to be highly coordinated. You have to have a check-in every night. Where have we made progress? Where are we still up against a wall or somebody that's refusing to believe us? But it really begged, it asked for creativity, different approaches, and how can you go above and beyond to really meet the moment? And it was incredibly rewarding, but incredibly exhausting all at once.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing and, opening the curtain a little bit to the behind the scenes.
So we have the classic phenomenon of time crunch and more people asking questions. So is it okay if we take 2 or 3 and just be particularly concise just because of, yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Landon. I'm a freshman here at SIS and I'm interested in Eastern Europe. And I just wanted to ask you specifically about Poland, like what's in the future for them in terms of like the defense industry and also like defending against Russian attacks or, interference within their country because they do have that kind of historical influence. And I just want to keep it like, short so you can just talk about Poland if that's okay.
Okay, second question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us. My name is Mackenzie Kalichi. I'm a junior here at SIS. I wanted to ask a question in regards to what you said earlier about capabilities and how NATO provides kind of strict capabilities that the EU sometimes can't always fulfill. So I wanted to ask, how does the EU and NATO kind of work to collaborate to fill those capabilities, especially in wartime right now? And then will we see a kind of either a moving to closer to the relationship between EU and NATO to make up these capabilities in the short term? Or are we seeing under a distance kind of less Berlin plus, more of like NATO gets its own weapons?
Yes, old Berlin Plus, here we are. Everything comes back to Berlin Plus. It's hard to predict where this is all going. I mean, obviously, you've got President Macron's view, which is this is our moment. We're going to invest in ourselves. We're going to work towards strategic autonomy, mostly from the United States. We're going to free ourselves of relying on the United States for our security. We're going to invest in European defense industries. We're going to buy European. We're not going to buy American. He's running around telling all capitals, don't buy American kit anymore. Invest in European capabilities. But then there are alternative viewpoints. There are the realists who say that all sounds grand, but at this present day, we will have to rely on the US for some capabilities. I mean, Patriots are best in class. Most allies in Europe want Patriots. Many of them want the F-35. That could change over time. But right now, the US defense industry is postured. The UK defense industry is postured. South Korea, in some ways, is postured to deliver kit to Europe now when they need it. Because most allies in Europe have pretty severe capability gaps because of their generous contributions to Ukraine. So Romania, for example, has given away all its air defense. So it's relying almost exclusively on the United States and France. They're both on the ground in Romania, and on NATO for their air defense requirements. So I can't imagine kind of what this is going to look like in a decade. It could be completely turned on its head. But right now, now you're going to see this very messy debate between Europe can do it all, we don't need the US for anything, or we need the US for a little while, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, and then we're going to kind of wean ourselves off of US defense industry and the security umbrella to kind of provide for our own security. But this is a long way away. So in terms of the EU and NATO, I do think both Collis and Ruta are determined to make this relationship work and deepen it and make it better, particularly on, I don't know if you realize, but NATO and the EU actually can't share classified information, which is insane when you think about it. And so they need to sort that out because they need to be sharing NATO standards and be read into the NATO defense planning process more so than they are now. Okay, Poland. Poland is really positioned, again, to be a leader in Europe. This is a country that's putting real money on the table, aiming to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It has been absolutely indispensable in the war in Ukraine. The hub through which all military assistance flows to Ukraine exists and is situated in Poland. And that hub without that, we wouldn't have been able to support Ukraine in the way that we did. So Poland's refugee policy on welcoming Ukrainians, its NATO policies, its national policies, its spending policies, its determination to help Ukraine, it's really showing incredible leadership across the board. And I think it is positioning itself to it's always wanted to join the Quad. The Quad isn't supposed to exist in the NATO alliance. We really don't want any regional groupings in the alliance, but in reality, the Nordics sometimes meet, and sometimes, France, Germany, the UK, and the US meet and talk about a few things. The Western Balkan allies get together. There's a B9/B8 configuration in Eastern Europe. They meet from time to time. The reality is there are some regional groupings in the alliance. Poland wants to be in every meeting. It wants to be the leader of the Nordic Baltic group. It wants to be the leader of the B8. It wants to join the Quad and be there with the United States, France, Germany, and the UK. And so we'll just have to see how this goes. I think they are postured to lead. I find that Poland's bringing a lot of innovation into the alliance, a lot of fresh thinking. One other fun fact for you, NATO just opened something called JATEC, JATEC, the Joint Analysis and Training Education Center. It's a mouthful. What it is that the Ukrainians will come into Poland and share all the best practices and lessons learned with the allies on how to combat Russians using new technology and old legacy systems. They've done remarkable things in Ukraine on that front. And Poland said, why don't we host a lessons learned center on Polish territory? Another example of Polish innovation. So this is a country that's really eager to lead. And we'll just have to see how its relationship with the US unfolds, how it postures itself between France and Germany, what kind of leadership we have in Poland. They go from here. But in terms of resources, they are definitely positioning themselves to lead.
Yes. Thank you. Rebecca Davidson. I'm a student here at SAS. The war in Ukraine will end. As you know, there was a NATO-Russia council previously. Yeah, so I'm curious, looking towards the future.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But in class, and now bring all the whole.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking towards the future. How do you believe NATO should approach engagement with maybe a post-Putin Russia? Like, what does that look like? And do you think, is there even room for diplomacy? I don't know, like a decade from now.
So, yes, second question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Arjun. I'm a sophomore here at AU. So obviously with Europe being relatively underdeveloped in terms of technology relative to the US and China, they're in a vulnerable position from a defense standpoint, with warfare also coming in the form of, taking money and, cyber sort of infiltration. What do you think is the most realistic and politically feasible approach from EU parliamentarians to maintain a solid collaboration with the United States on AI and tech development in light of Trump protectionism and irrationality/unpredictability?
How much time do you have? Yeah. That's a lot. That's a whole graduate thesis, I think. All right, I'll have to come back. I'll see if I could say something interesting on that front. But NATO-Russia Council. So you asked me for some of the more interesting memories or moments when I felt especially proud of our work at NATO together. What we forget is before Russia went into Ukraine, it delivered these two treaties. Remember, the one to the United States and one to NATO, with kind of a long list of maximalist demands, basically saying NATO would end enlargement and all sorts of things that it wanted NATO to do to opt for an kind of an off ramp and not go to war in Ukraine. And so we decided on January 12th of 2022, before the war started, to hold a NATO-Russia Council at NATO. So this is like my third week on the job because I had been commuting back and forth between Brussels and Washington. And I just moved my family to Brussels. The first day I go into the office, we have the NRC. Wendy Sherman flies in, Deputy Secretary of State. She's in the chair for the United States. And Grushko comes in from Russia, and he is loaded for bear. And we sit in alphabetical order. He sits at the table, a few countries down from me, from Wendy, actually. I'm backbenching her. And he just spent 4 long hours trying to pick off individual allies and see if he could goad somebody or try and create some sort of division in the alliance. He was revisiting history from 30 years ago and going into individual bilateral relationships that Russia had with some of the Western Balkan countries. I mean, he tried every possible angle. And what was so priceless about that moment was that we kind of all went in and locked arms and said, we cannot bend. We cannot show like an inch of disunity. And even though we were fighting before the meeting, it was amazing to go in and everybody locked arms and we sat at the table and it was like, no, no, no. And every time he tried to drive a wedge, everybody came back with the hammer, and it was unbelievable. And Wendy Sherman closes this whole thing with this impromptu speech. It's rare for anyone to come back a second time with their intervention. But she comes back again and basically says to Grushko, whom she knew, we walked in the room, as 30 separate allies, but we speak today as one. And you won't, I can't remember the exact wording, but you will not succeed in dividing us. We stand united in opposition to your maximalist demands. Happy to talk to you about arms control and other subjects, but not what you're asking. And it was just priceless. A beautiful moment of the allies coming together, speaking to the value of the alliance. That moment, the unity that existed in that room mattered, and it needed to be more than the United States. It needed to be all of us sitting together. So what do we do with the NRC now? I mean, we basically said once the war started, that's it. We're going to have to get rid of the NRC. And the alliance is, in theory, in the process of revisiting its Russia strategy right now, with the hopes that by the summit, although this is not going to happen with a new U.S. administration and given its current posturing, I think there was some sense that NATO would roll out a new Russia strategy this June, but I think they're going to kick the can on that. So stay tuned. It's going to be complicated in light of what's happening in the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, or the United States and Russia. So I don't know where it's headed. I believe in the utility of dialogue. I was glad that Grushko came in and heard that from the allies. We needed to spend those 4 hours we'll never get back together in that room. So I can't really say with any certainty where it's going. Okay, now on the thesis question we had, where did the questionnaire go? In the back? Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And I think Europe's asking itself, how do we insert ourselves into a world where China and the US are drastically outpacing us on tech and AI and quantum, and the list is long. And so NATO has tried to play a small, helpful role in this regard. It started something called the Innovation Fund, which is a €1 billion venture capital fund that is designed to help fund projects that would serve the interests of all NATO allies in the area of new technologies. You can go to its website. It's not in NATO, it's NATO adjacent. So it's a separate VC that's been established. Does this really solve Europe's problems? No. A lot of this work needs to be done at the European Union. That's where they obviously have immense regulatory power. Although that's irritating a lot of tech startups and companies, because they feel like all the EU does is regulate instead of really joining the effort in the race to the future. So I would watch what's happening in the European Union. I think there's more work there in the area of tech. And again, NATO feels like it's dabbling in this space, but probably isn't going to position Europe to kind of join the US and China in this race to the future and wherever AI may be taking us.
So I'm mindful of time. I really, really want to deeply thank Ambassador Julianne Smith, because this community is richer for having our alums engaging with us and for imparting their wisdom for all the walks of life that they follow. I want to thank you not for braving the weather, but for foregoing the weather for an hour. That is a real, yeah. And otherwise for, Alice and all our events team for always making this room impeccable and welcoming for these events. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can't see, I wasn't expecting that.